The late autumn wind slipped through the narrow streets of the small Canadian town, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Emily walked slowly along the sidewalk, white cane sweeping gently in front of her, counting the taps against the familiar cracks in the pavement. She had been blind since childhood, and every sound, every smell, every tiny change in the air was part of the map she carried in her mind. Her coat was old but neatly pressed, the wool beginning to pill at the sleeves. She didn't own much, but what she had, she cared for with quiet pride. As she approached the bus stop, she tilted her head, listening for the hiss of the doors and the murmur of early commuters. To most people, it was an ordinary Monday. To Emily, every day she made it on her own felt like a small, stubborn victory. Her life was simple, almost painfully so, but it had a gentle rhythm that comforted her. Every morning, she caught the same bus, sat in the same seat near the front, and listened to the same driver greet her with a warm, "Good morning, Emily." She worked part-time at a small community center, answering phones and helping organize schedules with a software that read the screen aloud. Her co-workers liked her, not because they pitied her, but because she was careful, punctual, and always willing to stay a little longer if someone needed help. She lived in a tiny basement apartment in an old brick building, with walls that carried the muffled sounds of neighbors' TVs and arguments. At night, when things were quiet, she would make tea, sit on her worn-out couch, and escape into the only world where she could see clearly, the world of stories people told her online. For Emily, the internet was not a place of flashy images or endless videos, it was a world of words and voices. She used a screen reader and dictated her messages with slow, patient care. In a chat group for people with disabilities, she had met someone named Daniel. He said he was 35, worked in finance, and lived a few hours away in a larger city. To Emily, he sounded like the kind of man who didn't mind waiting for her thoughtful replies. They started talking about small things at first: favorite books, the sound of rain, the feeling of hot chocolate on a cold day. Over time, their conversations grew deeper, winding into fears, regrets, and dreams both of them had never dared to share with anyone else. When he called her Em for the first time, her heart had done a nervous little flip in her chest. Daniel never sent photos, but Emily never asked. She didn't care what he looked like, she couldn't see him anyway. She cared about the gentle patience in his messages, the way he remembered small details she had mentioned weeks earlier. He knew about her blindness, about the accident that had taken her sight before she could even form solid memories of colors and shapes. He knew she worked hard but still struggled to pay rent, that she sometimes skipped meals to make the money stretch until the end of the month. His response had not been pity, it had been a quiet, steady admiration. He told her she was stronger than most people he knew, and that, in another life, he would have driven to her city just to take her for coffee and listen to her laugh all afternoon. That sentence alone had kept Emily smiling for days. As their messages turned into nightly voice calls, Emily felt the border between friendship and something more begin to blur. She tried to be careful, life had taught her that promises were often broken, especially the ones that sounded too kind. Still, there was something about his voice, calm, warm, with a hint of tiredness at the edges, that made her feel safe. When he called her late after a long day, she imagined him loosening his tie, rubbing his forehead, and sinking into a chair while he told her how exhausting the office could be. She pictured him not as rich or powerful, but as a man who often ate alone and stared too long at spreadsheets that didn't care if he was lonely. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season brushed softly against her window, Daniel asked her a question that made her heart stop for a moment. "Em," he said, his voice softer than usual, "do you ever think about meeting in person?" She had paused, fingers tightening around the mug of lukewarm tea in her hands. Her first instinct was fear of being disappointed, fear of being a burden, fear that he would look at her and see only the cane, the cloudy eyes, the second-hand clothes. Yet beneath the fear, there was a quiet, stubborn hope. She had dreamed of feeling his hand in hers, of knowing that the voice that had kept her company on so many lonely nights belonged to someone real, standing right in front of her, breathing the same winter air. "I think about it," she had answered carefully, choosing each word. "But I don't want you to feel obligated. My world is complicated. Not everyone wants to step into it." On the other end of the call, he had let out a slow breath, one she could almost feel brush against her skin. "Em," he said, If I wanted an easy life, I wouldn't be staying up to talk to you when I have to be at the office at 6. I don't feel obligated. I feel drawn to you." His words settled into her like the glow of a fireplace in a dark room. For the rest of the night, she lay awake, listening to the creaking pipes and the occasional car passing outside, replaying that sentence over and over until sleep finally softened it into a dream. They agreed to meet halfway, in a nearby city with a busy downtown and a large shopping center Emily had only ever heard about on the radio. Daniel said he had business meetings there often, and it would be easy for him to arrange a day. He insisted on covering her bus fare. She refused at first, pride flaring, but he argued gently until she gave in with a shy laugh. They picked a Saturday, 2 weeks away, and decided to meet at a cafe inside the mall, near the main entrance. Emily memorized every detail he described: the smell of fresh espresso, the hum of conversation, the position of the counter relative to the door. For the first time in a long while, she counted the days not by bills due or shifts at work, but by how many remained until she would finally hear his voice in the same space as the sound of his footsteps. In another part of the province, in a sleek glass penthouse overlooking the city skyline, Adrian Carter stared at his reflection in the dark window, his phone buzzing quietly on the table beside him. To the public, Adrian was a familiar face in business magazines and news articles about successful investors. To his shareholders, he was a genius who turned risky markets into growing profits. But to himself, in the moments when he allowed the silence of his apartment to press in, he felt like a man who had built a tower of numbers so high he could no longer see the ground. His life was full of luxury, designer suits, private drivers, dinners at the most exclusive restaurants, yet he could not remember the last time anyone had touched his arm simply because they cared how he was feeling. Adrian had always kept a strict distance between himself and strangers. Too many people wanted something from him: a favor, a connection, a donation, a backdoor into his companies. His security team filtered his calls, his assistants sorted his emails, and even his social media presence was carefully curated by people paid to make him look approachable without ever letting anyone close. But lately, the emptiness had started to gnaw at him in ways he could no longer ignore. His doctor had told him his stress levels were too high and his sleeping pills were a temporary bandage, not a cure. Some nights, he would lie awake listening to the quiet hum of the city below, wondering if there was a single person out there who would care about him if he lost everything tomorrow. It was on one of those sleepless nights that Adrian, against his usual instincts, wandered into an online community using a pseudonym, hoping to feel, for a moment, like an ordinary man. He had not gone there to deceive anyone, only to escape the constant pressure of his name. But life, as he was about to discover, had other plans. When his head of security later mentioned that there had been concerning attempts to reach him through that same platform, Adrian's first reaction was irritation. He didn't want his private escape monitored like a corporate account. The security chief, however, insisted on tightening control of his online presence. Adrian reluctantly agreed, not realizing how deeply that decision would tangle him in the life of someone he had never met, and yet who would soon change him completely. A week before Emily's planned trip, a member of Adrian's security team named Mark sat in a cramped office filled with monitors, combing through suspicious messages flagged by their system. One account in particular had caught their attention: a man using Adrian's photo, claiming to be a moderately successful finance worker named Daniel. The profile didn't boast about private jets or mansions. It described long hours, quiet evenings, and a loneliness that sounded painfully real. But to Mark's trained eye, the stolen photo was clear as day. It was Adrian in a rare candid shot, laughing with a colleague outside a conference center. Whoever this Daniel was, he'd been clever enough to choose an image that looked ordinary, not like a glossy magazine cover. Mark scrolled through the fake profile's recent activity and felt his jaw tighten. Among the messages and group chats, one conversation stood out: long, consistent, stretching back months. The messages were gentle, filled with vulnerability and small, personal details. The other user's name was Emily. She often mentioned taking the bus, working at a community center, and navigating the world without sight. Mark was not an emotional man, but there was something unsettling about the way the imposter seemed to lean on her trust, weaving himself into the quiet spaces of her life. When he read the part about them planning to meet in a mall cafe, his professional instincts flared into alarm. This wasn't just a scam for money, this could be dangerous. The next morning, Mark requested a private meeting with Adrian. Standing in the doorway of the billionaire's minimalist office, he felt the usual weight of the man's cool, analytical gaze. Mark explained the situation step by step, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He told Adrian about the fake profile, the stolen photo, the months of conversations with a blind woman who clearly had no idea she was being deceived. Adrian listened in silence, fingers steepled under his chin, his expression growing darker with each detail. The thought of someone using his image to manipulate a vulnerable stranger stirred something in him that had nothing to do with corporate risk and everything to do with basic decency. "So she thinks she's meeting me," Adrian said slowly, more to himself than to Mark. The absurdity of it was almost enough to make him laugh, but there was nothing amusing about a woman traveling alone to meet a man who did not exist. "We can contact her through the platform, warn her, tell her it's a fake," Mark suggested. "We can also have someone from local authorities present at the mall, just in case." Adrian tapped the desk lightly with one finger, staring at the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Do we know when this meeting is supposed to happen?" he asked. When Mark named the date and time, Adrian exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Put the security team on it. And I'll go too." Mark blinked, caught off guard. In all the years he had worked for Adrian, the man had never volunteered to step directly into a situation like this, especially one that could easily be handled from a distance. "Sir, that might not be necessary," Mark began carefully. "We can resolve this without putting you in the middle." Adrian shook his head, his decision already solidifying. "Someone used my face to lure her there," he said quietly. "If anything happens to her because of that, I'll know I could have done more and chose not to. I won't live with that." Mark studied him for a moment, then nodded. Orders were orders, but beneath the formal obedience, there was a flicker of respect. When he left the office, he began adjusting the day's schedule, unaware that this single change would unravel the careful distance Adrian had built between himself and the rest of the world. On the Saturday of the meeting, the mall was alive with the sounds of weekend shoppers, the echo of footsteps on polished tiles and the distant laughter of children bouncing through the open spaces. Emily stepped off the bus, heart pounding, her cane tapping a familiar rhythm that did nothing to calm the storm inside her. She had dressed as nicely as she could, smoothing her one decent blouse and making sure her hair was neat and freshly washed. In her small, crossbody bag, she carried a folded piece of paper with the cafe's name and simple directions written in large letters by a coworker. As she moved through the mall, she focused on the scents, freshly baked pastries, perfume from a nearby shop, the faint tang of cleaning products. Somewhere in this wide, echoing place, the man who had listened to her soul for months was waiting. When she reached the cafe, guided by a kind stranger who noticed her hesitation, Emily paused near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Her chest tightened as different voices washed over her, orders being called, cups clinking, chairs scraping against the floor. She checked the time on her talking watch. She was 5 minutes early. Daniel had promised he would be there before her, so she wouldn't have to feel lost in an unfamiliar space. She took a soft breath, trying to steady herself, and lifted her chin. To everyone else, she was just a blind woman standing alone at the edge of a busy cafe. To Emily, this moment was the fragile border between the life she had always known and the life she might, just might, be about to step into. Daniel was supposed to recognize her by the small silver charm she had mentioned on her bag, but minutes passed and no one approached. Emily stayed still, listening carefully for the familiar cadence of his voice, the one she could recognize even through the noise of dozens of strangers. Every time a nearby conversation shifted in tone, her hope jumped, only to settle back into quiet unease. She told herself he might be caught in traffic or delayed by one of his meetings. She chose patience over worry, though the tightness in her chest suggested her heart was not as calm as her thoughts. She adjusted her grip on the cane and kept her posture straight, determined not to look unsure. Inside, however, a tremor of doubt began to ripple through the excitement she had carried all morning. Across the wide hallway from the cafe, Adrian watched from a distance as two discreet members of his security team blended into the crowd near him. He wore a dark coat and kept a simple baseball cap low over his forehead, an outfit chosen not for style, but anonymity. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary professional waiting for someone who hadn't yet arrived. But his eyes were fixed on Emily, standing alone at the cafe entrance. Watching her, Adrian felt a strange tension twist in his chest. She looked exactly as Mark had described, careful in her movements, composed, and vulnerable without seeming fragile. This wasn't an abstract victim of online impersonation anymore. This was a real woman, breathing the same air, waiting on a light tied inexplicably to his own face. He checked the time and then nodded subtly to one of his guards, who stepped toward the cafe door to watch more closely without approaching her. Their goal was simple: intercept the imposter, if he showed up, and ensure Emily was safe. Adrian had planned to remain strictly an observer, but the longer he stood there, seeing her alone and unaware, the more that plan felt cold and insufficient. He imagined how terrifying this experience must be for her: the anticipation, the risk, the courage it took to trust someone she had never met. The thought nagged at him: if someone had been deceiving her, what would the truth do to her now? Would it be safer to let security handle it quietly, or would she deserve to hear the truth gently, face to face? 5 more minutes passed. Emily's hope began to thin into confusion. She sent a quick voice message through her phone, keeping her tone light. "Hey, I'm at the cafe entrance. Are you close?" As she waited for the familiar notification sound, she brushed her thumb repeatedly over the silicone loop of her bag charm, a small, unconscious gesture of self-comfort. Around her, the cafe's music hummed, and a barista laughed loudly at something a colleague said. Daniel didn't answer. Each second stretched longer than the last, and the quiet inside her became heavier. She wondered if she had misunderstood the directions or arrived at the wrong cafe. Doubt crept in like cold fingers. From across the hall, Adrian saw her lift her phone, heard faintly the sound of a message being sent, though he couldn't make out the words. His own phone buzzed at the same moment. It was Mark. The fake account went offline 10 minutes ago. No activity since. Adrian clenched his jaw. There was a decent chance the imposter had panicked and disappeared, leaving Emily waiting for someone who would never appear. Letting her stand there alone felt wrong. The original plan was to keep distance, but something deeper stirred inside him now, something he could not name but could not ignore. He slipped his phone into his pocket and started to walk toward the cafe. As his steps echoed softly on the tile floor, Adrian rehearsed what he might say. "I think you may have been misled," sounded too clinical. "I'm sorry, but the men you were speaking to isn't real," felt too blunt. Each possible sentence seemed inadequate to cushion the shock he was about to deliver. He slowed when he reached the cafe threshold and stopped a few feet from Emily, unsure how to announce his presence. He didn't want to startle her. "Emily," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and measured. At the sound of her name spoken by a stranger, her shoulders lifted slightly, and she turned her face toward the voice. "Yes," she answered, cautious, trying to place the unfamiliar tone. It wasn't Daniel's voice. There was no immediate warmth, no recognizable rhythm. Her heart gave a small, painful lurch. "Is Daniel with you?" she asked quietly. Adrian swallowed. In that moment, looking at her milky, unfocused eyes behind simple glasses, he felt the full weight of the situation descend on him. "I'm afraid Daniel isn't coming," he said gently. "My name is Adrian. I need to talk to you about something important." Emily's brows knit together, confusion crossing her face like a shadow. She tightened her grip on the cane. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who are you?" Adrian took another careful step closer, conscious of not invading her space. "Someone used my photograph to pretend to be Daniel online," he explained. "Our security team discovered it. We came to make sure you'd be safe." Each word felt heavy, painful to offer. He braced himself for her reaction. For a long moment, Emily said nothing. The cafe noise seemed to fade away around them. Then her breath hitched sharply, and she drew herself inward, as if instinctively trying to shrink away from the blow of the truth. "So, he wasn't real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian shook his head slowly, knowing she could not see the gesture, and corrected himself verbally. No. I'm sorry. The person you spoke to was lying about who he was. Emily's free hand fluttered up to her chest, fingers pressing against her blouse as though she were steadying a racing heart. Memories rushed through her mind, months of conversations, shared laughter, quiet confessions poured into the safe space of late-night calls. Had it all been fake? Had the voice she trusted belonged to a stranger playing a game at her expense? The thought hollowed her out. She closed her eyes, though darkness already filled her world. Security staff nearby pretended to browse a kiosk, but their eyes stayed alert, ready to intervene if Emily became overwhelmed or if the imposter suddenly appeared. Adrian wished they weren't there, wished this moment could be private, because he could sense that what she was feeling now was delicate, raw, and intensely personal. I know this is a lot to process, he said quietly. You don't have to stand here. I can buy you a coffee if you'd like, or help you get home. Whatever you prefer. Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to retreat, to go back to the small safety of her familiar apartment and lock this painful surprise away. But another impulse, curiosity mixed with the need for understanding, held her in place. Please, she said softly, nodding without realizing it. Just explain. They stepped into the cafe together. A staff member guided them to a small corner table, assuming Adrian was helping a visually impaired friend. Once seated, Emily folded her cane and placed it against the table leg. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on her lap. Adrian ordered 2 coffees, choosing hers plain with milk as she had always mentioned liking it during those online conversations, a small detail that unexpected knowledge suddenly made feel fragile. When they were alone again, he explained everything as clearly as he could, the discovery of the fake account, the stolen photo, the scheduled meeting. He emphasized that she had never done anything wrong, that her trust had not been foolish. She listened in silence, drawing slow breaths between each painful realization. So all those messages, she said at last, her voice steadying with effort, they were from someone who hid behind you, behind your face. Adrian nodded again, then remembered to answer aloud. Yes. A heavy pause followed. Emily tilted her head slightly as if studying him through sound alone. And you? She asked. Why did you come yourself? You didn't have to. Adrian hesitated. The honest answer surprised even him. Because I didn't want you to feel like just another problem solved by strangers, he admitted. I wanted you to know someone cared enough to show up. The simplicity of the statement made Emily's throat tighten. When the coffees arrived, Emily wrapped both hands around the warm cup as though grounding herself. I feel silly, she murmured. I let myself believe someone special cared about me, just as I am. Adrian leaned slightly forward. That doesn't make you silly, he said firmly. It makes you human. His voice held conviction rather than gentle pity, and Emily felt a small spark of relief ignite at that difference. She did not want to be coddled. She wanted to be seen as capable of loving and being loved, even if the object of that love had turned out to be an illusion. They talked quietly for another half-hour. Emily asked about his real life, tasting the words millionaire investor with disbelief when he explained who he actually was. It amazed her that a man so wealthy could be sitting across from her in a modest mall cafe, speaking to her as if their worlds were not impossibly far apart. Adrian, in turn, asked about her daily routines, her job, the ways she navigated the city. He listened more than he spoke, deeply aware that he was not there to impress but to understand. The conversation began to soften the sharp sorrow of discovery into something gentler, something that almost felt like relief. At least now the lies were gone. When Emily finally rose to leave, Adrian offered his arm without hesitation. She accepted after a brief pause, linking her fingers lightly through his sleeve. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through both of them. As they walked toward the bus terminal together, surrounded by strangers unaware of the quiet transformation taking place between them, Emily spoke in a low, thoughtful tone. You know, she said, I came here thinking I was going to meet a man I loved. Instead, I met the man whose life someone borrowed to hurt me. And somehow, that doesn't feel like an accident. Adrian looked down at her, surprised by the gentle wisdom in her words. He didn't reply immediately, because for the first time in a very long while, he felt something shift inside his carefully guarded heart. He wondered if fate had not removed a lie from her life only to quietly place something real in its place. The bus terminal hummed with the dull energy of weekend travel, voices echoing beneath the high ceiling and luggage wheels rattling across the tiled floor. Emily kept her hand lightly looped around Adrian's arm as he guided her to a quieter bench near the boarding area. She could sense the vastness of the space through sound alone, each footstep bouncing back to her like distant raindrops. When they sat down, she reluctantly released his sleeve, suddenly aware of how quickly she had grown accustomed to the simple comfort of not feeling alone. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before, not awkward, but charged with thoughts neither of them voiced yet. Emily broke the silence first. "Tell me something real about you," she said softly. "Not the wealth. Not the titles. Just who you are when nobody's watching." Adrian was caught off guard. No one had asked him that so plainly in years. After a moment, he leaned back and let out a slow breath. "I'm someone who built walls before learning how to build connections," he replied. "I'm good at numbers, terrible at letting people get close. I tell myself it's safer that way." His words were simple, but they felt stripped of the usual gloss he wore in public. Emily listened intently, as if memorizing each syllable like a soundscape she could revisit later. She nodded slightly. "I understand that," she said. "I've built my own walls too. Mine aren't about money or power. They're about learning not to hope for more than what feels safe." For a moment, they shared a quiet understanding that bridged the massive gap in their life circumstances. Both had been shaped by fear, just in different flavors. Both had learned to expect little from others to protect themselves from disappointment. The discovery made Emily's chest ache in an oddly comforting way. Loneliness suddenly felt like a shared language. A bus announcement boomed overhead, calling destinations and departure times. Emily stiffened slightly, checking her watch again. Adrian noticed and gently said, "You still have 20 minutes." She exhaled, some of her tension easing. "I don't want to rush off," she confessed. "But I feel like everything I thought was solid this morning just vanished, and I'm standing in the middle of open ground." Adrian studied her profile, the way her head tilted as if constantly listening more deeply than most people. "Sometimes," he answered quietly, "open ground is where you finally get room to breathe." They spoke about small things then, lighter topics meant to steady the emotional tremor left by the truth. Emily described funny mishaps caused by overly confident GPS directions from her phone. Adrian shared stories about his inability to cook anything beyond scrambled eggs without setting off smoke alarms in his penthouse, which made her laugh softly. The sound surprised them both, it came so freely after the earlier pain. Adrian found himself smiling without forcing it, realizing how long it had been since he'd laughed without calculating whether it looked appropriate. As boarding time approached, a weight began to press into Adrian's chest. He did not want this fragile connection to end as abruptly as it had begun. On impulse, he said, "Emily, I know today started in a terrible way. I don't want to replace a lie with another empty moment. Would you be open to staying in touch? As ourselves, completely honest." Emily considered his words carefully. Trust had already been bruised today, yet she felt something different about this offer. No hidden persona. No imaginary stories. Just truth, as raw and uncertain as the ground beneath her feet. "Yes," she said after a pause. "I think I'd like that." They exchanged numbers, Emily dictating hers carefully so there was no confusion. Adrian typed it in slowly, double-checking each digit. "I promise," he said quietly, "there will be no pretending." Emily smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted," she replied. As she stood and unfolded her cane, Adrian rose with her. He walked her toward the bus line, keeping close but mindful not to control her movements. She navigated with practiced confidence, yet her proximity to him no longer felt like caution, it felt like quiet companionship. At the bus door, Emily paused. Around her, engines rumbled and passengers shuffled forward. She turned toward Adrian, lifting her face to the sound of his breath. "Thank you for not letting me leave believing I was unwanted," she said. The words struck him harder than he expected. He cleared his throat. "You were never unwanted," he answered. "You were misled. Those two things are not the same." She let the distinction rest in her heart, then extended her hand. He took it gently, their fingers wrapping around each other for the briefest moment before she stepped onto the bus. Adrian stood on the platform watching until the doors hissed shut and the bus rolled away into traffic. Only when it disappeared from view did he feel the hollowness return, though it was different now. Less empty, more anticipatory, as if something new had settled quietly in the spaces loneliness once occupied. Back in his car, as the driver pulled into the stream of vehicles, Adrian found his thoughts drifting not to business contracts or market forecasts, but to the steady warmth of Emily's hand in his and the wisdom in her calm voice. That evening, Emily sat once more on her worn couch, tea steaming beside her. The day replayed in her mind like an unpredictable movie plot: excitement, heartbreak, and then the unexpected arrival of comfort in the form of a man she never intended to meet. Her phone chimed. Her finger hovered nervously over the notification before she opened it. A message from Adrian appeared, simple and unadorned. "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely. I'm really glad I met you today." She exhaled slowly and typed back, "Thank you." "So did I." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. Their messages that night flowed gently, without the desperate intensity of earlier weeks. They spoke about music they liked, podcasts they followed, and the books Emily listened to through audio recordings. Adrian found himself sharing more than he usually did, admitting how draining public life felt and how rare it was for him to speak to someone uninterested in what he could provide materially. Emily, in turn, talked about the dream she had kept hidden: becoming a counselor for others with disabilities, though she felt too afraid to pursue the required training. Adrian encouraged her in ways no one had before, not with grand promises, but with sincere belief. Days passed into weeks. Their communication became a steady presence in both their lives. Adrian began calling her during late evenings, when business chaos finally quieted, and Emily would describe mundane details of her day that strangely soothed him. He noticed how hearing about community center bake sales and bus mishaps grounded him more effectively than any meditation app ever had. For Emily, Adrian's consistent honesty rebuilt the trust that had cracked within her. She knew precisely who he was now: no imagined Daniel, no masks, just a man trying to learn how to be genuine. They arranged to meet again, this time without secrets or confusion, at the same cafe. This meeting felt radically different. Emily approached not with anxious expectation but with calm curiosity. When she arrived, Adrian greeted her by gently saying her name, letting the familiarity of his voice guide her forward. There was no shock, no painful revelation awaiting, only two people choosing to sit down together because they genuinely wanted to. They spent the afternoon talking, laughter slowly weaving its way between thoughtful conversations. Each minute stitched a little more ease into their growing connection. Over time, Adrian found himself reshaping sections of his life around this unexpected relationship. He delegated more work, declined unnecessary social obligations, and even began visiting Emily's quiet town more often than he cared to admit to anyone. He did not hide her existence, but he cherished their privacy. There was something sacred to him about the woman who knew nothing of his fame yet understood the deepest shadows in his heart. With her, he did not feel like a billionaire or a public figure. He felt like a man simply learning how to relate. Emily, too, felt subtle changes within herself. Her world did not magically become easier, nor did her blindness vanish as a challenge. But she felt braver. She enrolled in a part-time online counseling course, encouraged by Adrian's belief and her own slowly growing confidence. Each small achievement, each completed assignment, each step toward her future, felt sweeter knowing there was someone celebrating her victories without overshadowing them. Adrian never offered to solve her problems with money. Instead, he offered something more empowering: unwavering emotional support. One evening, as they sat side by side listening to a local band play in the town park, Emily turned to Adrian with a thoughtful expression. "It's strange," she said softly. "I lost the person I thought I loved, and found the person I actually needed." Adrian smiled gently at the ground. Sometimes, he answered, we don't get what we want the way we want it, but we get what helps us become who we're meant to be. Their shoulders brushed lightly, neither pulling away. Under the open Canadian sky, full of cool breeze and distant laughter, two lives that should never have intersected continued weaving quietly together, completely real this time. The gentle routine they had built together began to feel as natural as breathing. Phone calls turned into longer visits, and longer visits slowly blurred into what felt like shared weekends. Adrian would leave the towering glass of his city behind and drive into Emily's quieter world, parking along streets lined with maple trees and modest brick homes. Emily came to recognize the sound of his car long before he reached her building. Each arrival felt like a small celebration, not because of who he was in the public eye, but because of how he treated her, with open patience, warmth, and steady respect that never crossed into pity. They spent hours walking along familiar sidewalks, Emily confidently navigating with her cane while Adrian matched his pace to hers without ever making her feel slowed down. He described the colors of the sky, the patterns of fallen leaves, the way shop windows glimmered in late sunlight, careful not to overwhelm her with detail. She loved hearing the world translated into words, and he loved learning to see more deeply himself through explaining it. In those moments, Adrian realized how often he had truly looked at nothing, despite having perfect vision. Emily, without sight, seemed to notice far more than most people he knew. At home, they cooked simple meals together. Emily measured ingredients by touch and habit, while Adrian chopped vegetables somewhat clumsily under her gentle guidance. Laughter often filled the small kitchen as he inevitably misjudged a cut or dropped something on the floor. He had prepared gourmet meals in expensive restaurants but had never known this kind of quiet domestic joy. There was something profoundly grounding about standing shoulder to shoulder with Emily over a simmering pot, not surrounded by servers or luxury, but by shared effort and connection. Their conversations grew deeper as trust continued to mend and flourish. Emily spoke openly about the emotional isolation blindness had sometimes imposed, how people either became overly protective or emotionally distant around her. Adrian shared how wealth had produced a different kind of isolation, one rooted in suspicion and control. Both discovered that despite their wildly different experiences, the emotional consequences were strikingly similar. Loneliness did not discriminate by circumstance. It lingered wherever vulnerability went unwelcomed. As months passed, Emily's counseling studies intensified. Some evenings she felt drained by the theoretical weight of her coursework and doubted her ability to succeed. Adrian would sit beside her on the sofa, encouraging her with gentle words when she hesitated. He never pressured her pace. He simply stayed near, steady as an anchor. His quiet presence restored her strength more effectively than any pep talk ever could. And slowly, Emily began to believe not only in the dream itself, but in her right to chase it. Adrian, too, underwent transformation. Spending time with Emily shifted the values he once prioritized. He began downsizing his social obligations, selling his rarely used vacation homes, and simplifying parts of his life no one had touched before. Power deals and high-profile dinners slowly lost their urgency. What excited him instead were moments like guiding Emily through a bookstore, reading aloud jacket summaries as she selected audiobooks, or sitting with her during winter snowfall while they listened to the hush blanket the streets outside. One afternoon, as they walked along a frozen lakeside path, Emily paused and turned toward him. "You've changed," she said thoughtfully. Adrian smiled softly. "So have you." Emily tilted her head. "What if one day you realize you don't fit here anymore?" she asked quietly. "Or I realize I don't fit in your world?" Her question touched a vulnerability both had quietly feared yet never voiced. Adrian studied the shimmer of ice beyond the railing before answering. "Maybe fitting isn't the goal," he said. "Maybe choosing is." Emily absorbed the words, letting their meaning settle deep within her heart. Later that evening, over cups of steaming tea, Emily spoke more openly about the anxiety gnawing at her. "I still worry I'll be left behind," she confessed. "It happens to people like me. Lives drift apart." Adrian reached slowly for her hand and held it firmly but gently. "No one is leaving," he said with certainty. Relationship distance isn't measured in background or status. It's measured by willingness to stay. The steadiness in his voice calmed something long restless inside her. Her course progressed steadily until the official certification exam loomed ahead. Emily trained tirelessly, recording lectures, rehearsing evaluation sessions, and studying case material by audio late into the night. Adrian adjusted his business travel around her schedule, never missing a major exam day. On the morning of her final evaluation, he drove her to the testing center, waiting outside for hours rather than returning to his office. When she emerged, her face tense with uncertainty, he stood instantly, ready for whatever emotion she needed to release. "I don't know if I passed," she said breathlessly. Adrian took her hands. "You already won," he said. "The result doesn't change the courage it took to try." Tears softened her eyes as she embraced him. That afternoon, the results arrived electronically. Emily had passed with high marks. She wept openly in his arms, overwhelmed by the reality that her dream was becoming tangible. Adrian felt deeper pride in that moment than he ever had closing a multi-million-dollar deal. As Emily began volunteering as a trainee counselor within her own community center, her confidence blossomed. Her voice gained firmness during client sessions, and her empathy deepened with lived experience. Watching her growth inspired Adrian to reconsider how his wealth could better support causes aligned with impact rather than image. He quietly funded several local accessibility projects, refusing public acknowledgement. Emily only learned of his involvement indirectly when facilities upgraded equipment and credited an anonymous donor. One night, sitting quietly beneath a canopy of stars at a remote cabin Adrian rented, Emily whispered, "I once believed love meant being rescued." Adrian ran his thumb over her knuckles in response. "And?" he asked. "Now I think love means being strengthened," she replied. The statement filled the cold evening air with truth. Adrian leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently. The intimate gesture spoke volumes neither felt needed vocalizing. Though not physically dependent on him, Emily now welcomed emotional interdependence as a source of strength rather than weakness. Adrian no longer feared allowing someone to see beyond the gloss of confidence into the quieter insecurities beneath. Together they discovered that authenticity was not vulnerability alone, it was mutual courage. As spring edged into the landscape, life continued to weave deeper with shared layers of healing and growth. Their story had begun with deception, confusion, and pain. But through honesty and compassion, something enduring had emerged. Two very different souls choosing to walk forward side by side, not because destiny forced them together, but because they actively chose to remain. The lie that brought them into the same moment had evaporated completely, leaving only reality, raw, beautiful, and far more meaningful than the fantasy Emily once believed in. What began as heartbreak had transformed into a partnership built on trust, respect, and unexpected love that neither of them had ever anticipated finding. And as the winds carried fresh blossoms through the streets of her small town, Emily knew something gentle yet powerful had changed within her. For the first time, she no longer feared the darkness she lived in, because she had found a connection that made even the unseen world glow with warmth and possibility. Summer arrived quietly, warming the small town and softening the edges of daily routines. Emily noticed the change through sound and scent, the constant buzz of cicadas at dusk, the thick sweetness of flowers drifting through open windows, the lighter footsteps of people no longer bundled against winter cold. Adrian visited more frequently now, staying for entire weekends instead of rushing back to the city. Their time together had settled into an easy rhythm that required no effort to maintain. Silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt full of comfort, of shared understanding, of the unspoken knowledge that both had chosen this connection deliberately. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Emily suddenly laughed and said, "Isn't it strange how our story started?" Adrian smiled, stirring a pot beside her. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it," he replied gently. "Someone pretended to be me, and somehow that led to the truest version of my life." Emily raised an eyebrow playfully. "And the strangest part is that I never needed to see you to know that," she said. He stopped stirring for a moment and met her face, absorbing the quiet depth of her words. Later that night, they sat on the porch listening to crickets. Adrian hesitated, then spoke more seriously. Emily, I used to believe I was destined to be alone, he admitted. Wealth builds distance before it builds comfort. It isolates more than it provides. Emily nodded slowly. Blindness does the same thing, she replied. People either lean too close or step too far away. Few treat you simply as equal. Their shared acknowledgement of isolation deepened the emotional bond they'd built over months of quiet trust. Over time, Emily's counseling role expanded into a formal position at the community center. Her clients responded deeply to her empathy and emotional clarity. Many found comfort in speaking to someone who truly understood hardship without judgment. Adrian often listened as Emily described breakthroughs with individuals struggling to accept their own limitations or losses. He admired her natural gift, seeing how it grew not only from training but from the pain she had once endured herself. Her work reminded him that true strength was born from resilience, not comfort. One afternoon while walking beside the river, Adrian stopped abruptly. Emily felt the pause and turned toward him questioningly. "What is it?" she asked. Adrian took a breath and knelt slowly in front of her, gently taking her hands into his. Her pulse quickened instantly. "Emily," he said softly, his voice steady yet trembling beneath the surface, "you met me through confusion, disappointment, and loss, yet you chose to stay, to trust again. You didn't fall for a lie, you rose beyond it." Her lips parted slightly, heart pounding. He continued, "I don't want to build two separate lives anymore. I want to build one with you, fully honest, fully equal." He pressed a small ring into her palm, allowing her to feel its smooth band and subtle etched pattern. "Will you marry me?" Emotion flooded Emily all at once. Tears welled instantly behind her closed eyelids. She traced the ring slowly with trembling fingers, as if mapping its shape into memory. "Yes," she whispered. "I already chose you a long time ago." Adrian rose and pulled her into a warm embrace as sunlight shimmered across the water behind them. Their laughter turned into tears, both overwhelmed by the quiet miracle of this moment. No crowds. No cameras. Just two lives forever altered by unexpected truth and deliberate love. Word spread gently through Emily's close circle first. Her co-workers were stunned yet joyful when she announced the news. None could believe the gentleman they'd occasionally seen with her in town was the same billionaire whose face appeared on business publications. Adrian, however, insisted the wedding remained small and private, focused not on status, but on meaning. "What matters is who's present in the heart, not the headlines," he told her. The ceremony took place in a sunlit chapel near the lake, a place known more for peace than prestige. Emily walked down the aisle guided by Adrian's aunt, her veil brushing softly across her shoulders. Hearing the slow swell of music and the warmth of loved ones seated around her, she felt more seen than at any other moment of her life. Adrian waited at the front, suit impeccably tailored yet heart laid bare. The vows were spoken simply, without embellishment or grandeur. Emily promised to keep trusting even when fear whispered caution. Adrian promised never to hide behind walls of distance again. Their rings slid safely into place, matching each other in more than design, symbols of endurance written through honesty rather than fantasy. Their first dance took place beneath quiet string lights on the lakeside lawn. Emily rested her head against Adrian's chest as they swayed slowly to soft music. She could not see the stars glowing above them, but she felt the warmth of the night and the steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. "I feel like the richest woman in the world," she whispered. Adrian kissed her temple gently. "You already were," he replied. "You just taught me how to recognize it." Life after marriage did not transform into fantasy perfection. There were challenges adapting to shared routines and navigating public curiosity once their relationship became known. But the partnership remained grounded in transparency. They split time between city and town, refusing to sacrifice comfort or independence for convenience. Emily continued working as a counselor, advocating fiercely for accessibility initiatives. Adrian expanded his philanthropy, creating foundations dedicated to disability inclusion, all shaped by Emily's real-world insights. Years later, when journalists occasionally asked Adrian how he met his wife, he would smile softly and answer, "Through a mistake that turned into truth." He never elaborated for headlines. The story belonged only to them. On quiet evenings, Emily and Adrian often returned to that same porch where they once sat, discovering the rhythm of trust. They held hands in peaceful silence, the past no longer heavy with deception, but gently transformed into a reminder of the extraordinary places honest love can lead. And Emily, who once believed she had mistaken a millionaire for her online boyfriend, ultimately understood something far more powerful. She had never mistaken anything at all. She had found the man she was always meant to meet, only not the way she expected, but exactly the way she needed.